think for most Christians, they like to be sure that whatever they want to embark on, that it is the Lord leading them and they have a backing from God. And so the idea of God speaking to us, it's something that a lot of Christians would want to be confident about. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today, because it can make all the difference to how you're getting on with things in this world. Welcome back to Explore the Word podcast. And if you're tuning in for the first time, you're welcome too. The aim of this podcast is to encourage you to develop your relationship with God through the study of His Word. I think most Christians would agree that the Bible is the guiding principle that is available to us at all times and in all situations. And so looking at or referencing things that we believe the Lord says to us, or the way He's guiding us through looking at scriptures, is a very good thing. And so we're going to be talking about how the Lord spoke to people in time past, things that we have recorded in the Bible. And I think going back to the previous episode, I talked about how the Lord spoke to people before the Bible was, in the way we have it today. But certainly the Lord speaks to us individually as His children, and He does guide us. So in this episode, we're going to look at how He spoke to people in Bible times that we have recorded in the scriptures, and we can learn from those ways. Previously on my YouTube channel, I've made videos about how the Lord speaks to us and in the way He spoke to people in time past. And I remember one of the things I said then is the fact that if we have a Bible, and anybody that does have a copy of the Bible is in possession of God's mind about everything that we can think, everything that we need to know, and they're just there sitting and waiting for us to retrieve them. And as I was mulling over getting ready for this podcast, I came across that again, and I thought, actually, this is so true. And how much of this do I, as a person, actually tap into? And I remember saying to myself that I need to be mindful of this and make sure that I am, relating things I have in the scriptures to my life and using examples that I have in the scriptures to apply to all situations in my life and know the mind of God about these things. So I am saying the same to you listening, that if you've got a copy of the Bible, you can know the mind of God about every situation. So I hope this already resonates with you and you're going to take it away from this podcast. So looking at examples of how He spoke to men in the Bible, we saw that He used nature a lot. Again, if we go back to the book of Genesis, we see the Lord speaking to Abraham, and He said unto him in Genesis chapter 13, verse 16, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. And so if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. This was the Lord speaking to Abraham about, how numerous his descendants will be. So even if God was speaking to him in an audible voice, He still used the nature, the things that He created, to bring home to Abraham then what his descendants, the extent of growth that his descendant would experience. We also have another record where He said to him in verse 5 of chapter 15, it brought him from abroad and said, look towards heaven and tell the stars if you are able to number them. And He said unto him, so shall thy seed be. I think that's very similar to the way He spoke to him earlier that we looked at in verse 16 of Genesis chapter 13. And in a number of times we see the Lord speaking to other people as well with nature, you know, I've just been reading the book of Job, and the Lord was, when God finally spoke to Job and say, did you see the Leviathan or the bismuth? And he was describing, those were animals that Job would have known, and the expressions that the Lord was using about those natural beings, Job would have understood perfectly well. I can understand some of them, and that is God talking to him, or also to Job in that case, using the things that we can see in nature. And I think that sometimes, even if the Lord is not speaking audibly, we can see the way things are working naturally and use that to take that as the Lord speaking to us, because they are His creation and He's not going to go against His creation, because the Lord made them. And part of the purpose of Him creating us, or even the living things, is to reflect Him. And that's why we can learn from nature, even when it doesn't look as if He's speaking to us audibly, but we can see the principles of what He set out in nature and take it as Him guiding us, a guiding principle onto the way He wants us to maybe approach a situation, or even to get an answer for something that we're asking Him for. I see a lot of records of dreams that God, in cases where God spoke to people in dreams. So I know that He did that to Abimelech, that took Abraham's wife Sarah. God appeared to him in a dream and said to him, "You're a dead man because you have a man's wife." And this dream was so vivid, I'm sure that Abimelech was not in any way doubtful of it, that God was the one speaking to him, because he did what the Lord asked him to do and restored Sarah to her husband. That's not the, there was a point I thought God spoke. There's a lot of record of God speaking to kings using dreams. But another case is that of the Pharaoh, that the Lord told him what will become of the nation, warned him of the famine that was coming, and gave him that dream, two dreams that Joseph interpreted for him. And that was God preparing him, warning him about what was going to come. I know it's a lot more deep than just God's warning Pharaoh, because we know through that interaction that Joseph came to become, second in command in the land of Egypt, and his family eventually went into Egypt for survival during that widespread famine. So that was God speaking to a king. And we know that He also spoke to Solomon in a dream. And so it's an established way that God speaks to people, and because we see it then in scriptures, and I know He still does the same today. So God does speak through dreams, because He's done it. A lot of people also saw visions. I know that a lot of the prophets saw visions, like Isaiah said, in the year that the king Uriah died, I saw the Lord, and he went on and on about what he saw. And sometimes we know other prophets that were called seers as well, because they see things, and that was another established way that God spoke to people in the scriptures. I don't know of I'm not sure whether, well, I've never experienced vision before. It is possible that some people still have vision these days, but I don't really know of anybody that has experienced that. But we're talking on this podcast at this moment about the ways that the Lord spoke to people in the scriptures when the scriptures has already been written. So, like the King Solomon would have had the books of Moses, and so despite that, God still was speaking to him. God still spoke to him through dreams. And these other prophets that we're talking about, they had the books of Moses, and God still spoke to them by vision. And so we know that lots of them experience this in the scriptures. God is really good, and it's coming to mind how the other ways in which He spoke to somebody like Jeremiah, where He took him to the potter's house, and you know Jeremiah was watching the potter, and God, after he had finished, God then interrogated him about what the man was doing, and He spoke to him that way. So this is something that I see that makes me to know that God can actually speak to us through anything. He can speak to us through a situation. In the case of the potter, God spoke to um, Jeremiah that way, using the handiwork of a potter. And I'm sure He still does that today with His people. I mean, children of God, not necessarily talking about Israelites alone. So that's another way that we see in the scriptures, and possibly He does it today for people that would care to listen and pay attention to what God is saying through a situation. If He can speak through somebody that is, using clay to make pots, He can do it in other ways. Another example that's coming to mind is the story of the Rechabites. That they refused to drink wine because they said that their forefathers have already commanded them not to do that. And through that, the Lord spoke to the prophets, and using them as an example of how they should, or we as children of God, or even the Israelites then, should stick to the commandments of the Lord, because those people did not deviate from what their fathers taught them, and the Lord commended them for that. But God used that situation to speak, and so He can use situations to speak to us even today. So just as I said earlier on, about the fact that when I was preparing for this podcast, I looked at my old YouTube video and saw something I wrote down with regards to the fact that the Bible has, if we have the Bible, we have every answer to any question we want to ask God, really, and we only need to try and retrieve it. I think I'm going away towards the end of this podcast now, being thoughtful about the things I've been saying, and also trying to apply to myself, that I need to be more open to things around me, because our God is the God that made all things, and He can choose to use any situation, even His creation, particularly His creation, to speak to us at all times. So I would be paying more attention to things happening around me, and I hope you will do the same too. So if you have found this episode useful, please share with your friends and family, and also if you want more of my content, you can find them on my YouTube channel, which I will link into the show notes. And thank you for spending time with me, and I hope to spend some time as well again with you this time, same time next week. And until then, I would encourage you to search your scriptures for the nuggets that the Lord have hidden for us in there.